Good afternoon. It's a warm Sunday afternoon in Arkansas. There's a couple of verses in the book of Revelation that I wanted to touch upon. They're in chapter 17, 10, verses 10 and 11. It talks about kings and kingdoms. And there's been a lot of interpretation on what these verses mean. But let's read the verses and then we'll get into the interpretation. Verse 10, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Verse 11, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Now, if you look on YouTube, you'll find some various interpretations for this. Some of them I would say are pretty fantastical. The graphics are good, and so they might encourage people to think that's what they mean. Now, I did hear one the other day. I was looking on YouTube by Hank Hanegraaff, who's a well-known theologian, and he gives a good reasoned response to this. He describes the emperors of Rome during the time that John, when he wrote the Revelation, and he was able to make an understandable argument for these kings of the 5s and the 7 and the 8, particularly being within the Roman Empire. Now, I'm not entirely against that idea. I don't think that's the primary interpretation of what these verses go to, because I believe it's broader. I have to understand that prophecy, Revelation, is much tied to the book of Daniel throughout the gospel interpretations of the end times, meaning Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Those chapters describe Jesus' description of the end time. Now, when I say broad, these kings would refer to the broadness of the interpretation or the prophecy of Daniel. Daniel had this statue, and it had 4 empires: the head of gold, the arms and chest, and the belly, and the legs of iron, and the toes mired in clay and iron, with 10 kingdoms. Now, for those that have studied this, they understand those kingdoms have come, meaning the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, Greece, and then the Roman Empire, and then the future empire that we understand as the final 70th week of Daniel. That's why I think that this verse in Revelation is more strongly related to the Daniel prophecies and continuing them than to isolate them to the Roman Empire itself. Now, there is an aspect of the Bible, dual prophecy or dual interpretation, where you can have a near-far interpretation. So I'm not saying the emperor interpretation, the Roman emperor interpretation, would necessarily be wrong. It certainly can make sense, but usually in the main interpretation of prophecy, it is cohesive throughout the empires, the evil empires described by Daniel, and the future one that we're going to see here on earth is described by John as he was given the revelation by Jesus Christ. Now, the Daniel interpretation, which I think is the broader, and if I had to say what does this mean, I would refer it to the broader interpretation and not to the Roman emperor interpretation. Now, he says here, 7 kings, 5 are fallen. Let's take that. Now, at the time of John, there had been 5 previous kingdoms that were set against Israel and the Jews. Now, we understand that Daniel talked about 4 primary kingdoms, but what this does is it includes the entire biblical account of the empires that went against Israel and the early Jews. Well, it would be the early Hebrews at that time. But when you say 5 are fallen, it's not hard to look through the Bible and see which of these empires he's talking about. Certainly in the early Old Testament we can see Egypt as an evil empire. They took the Jews into captivity and slaves. And then we find in the second empire, we find a reference in 2 Kings, the book of 2 Kings, chapter 17 and 6. And I'll read that one very quickly. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan and the cities of the Medes. Now, certainly if your nation is taken prisoner, that would be an evil empire. And so we can easily say that the first two evil empires that John is talking about in the book of Revelation would be the Egyptians and the Assyrians. Now, at the time that Daniel wrote the prophecy as it was given by God, those two kingdoms have already passed. And we know that prophecy, it only makes sense to look at prophecy toward the future when you're looking at things to come. And that's exactly what Daniel did. So he had a vision of the statue, and I'm really going over this very quickly because the whole book of Daniel describes this in different chapters. With the Babylonians, which took the Israelis into captivity. Then you had the Mede-Persian Empire with the arms and breast of silver, and you had the belly of brass, which was the Grecian Empire, which had influence over the early Israel people. Then you had the Roman Empire, and that is the legs of iron in the statue. But legs are long, and that's where this kind of comes into importance here, because you have from the hips you had the belly of brass from Greece, and then you get into the legs of iron of Rome and the Roman lineage of empires. And then you get to the final 70th week, our future, which is described in the book of Revelation as the 70th week of Daniel, is what we describe it as, because it's listed as such. Now, so there we have four from Daniel, 2 prior, that's 6, and then you have another one, which we're going to get into, and then you have the final one. There are 8 total evil empires. And that is told us in verse 11, where it says that, and a beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Now, we can already see that this final empire, or Antichrist is probably a good way of describing him in this case, the king, was one of the previous 7. And of the previous 7 that disappeared, died, got removed from power, and he is basically, for lack of better words, reincarnated or reappears to be the 8th. So there are 8 empires. Now, history is easy to prove: the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And that brings us up to 5 at the time of John. 6, I'm sorry. 5 have fallen, 1 is. And the 1 is the Roman Empire that John experienced. So now there's a 7th one, and then there's a final one. And the final one is our future one. Now, here's the real debatable question. It's not debatable to me, but who is the 7th beast empire? Has it come, or has it still coming? Because if it's still coming, we have a seventh beast empire to experience. Well, actually Israel does. And then the final Antichrist empire at the end. Now there's a few things that probably one of the better interpreters of this was Robert Van Kampen. Came up with this idea that the seventh empire was Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler. And it fits all the parameters that he describes would make an evil empire. They have to be against Israel. It's not an empire that's against China, not an empire that's against Russia. It's an empire that is against Israel per se. Now, some people with different biblical end-time interpretations will say, just for an example, will say that the final prophecy of Revelation only refers to the Jews and not us, if you took a pre-tribulation stance. And I think that's incorrect, but that's broader than the topic I want to take here. But the point I do want to make is that when these empires take Israel captivity, or they perform evil things against the Israeli people, the Israeli people experience that directly, but the rest of the world experiences the other effects. I think it's safe to say, and I don't think it's a hard argument to say, that while the book of Revelation does talk a lot about the Jewish people and their experiences, it doesn't mean that Christians are not there for some part of that. Now, on record, I take a pre-wrath position, not pre-trib. Pre-wrath is somewhere after the middle point of the 70th week. Then you have the Great Tribulation, and then you have the rapture. Now that plan follows very well with, or exactly with, the description of Christ in his description in Matthew 24, which is the one that's used by Christ, by other theologians, for end-time Jesus prophetic interpretation or description. Again, that's not a point I'm trying to make here. I'm looking at history. And the history is that there were these evil empires in the past against the Israeli people. And I believe these are the ones they're talking about. And that is, again, the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Daniel future look of the Babylonian, the Mede-Persian, Greeks, Romans, and then you have the long legs, and then you have the future and final Antichrist or beast empire. Now understand this, going from 7 empires to 8 empires is only introduced in these verses here. But they were introduced in the first century when John wrote this. Many people will have initial thought of conflict, of saying that, is it possible that Hitler could have been that 7th beast empire? That seems kind of fantastic, but if you look at the horrific things that the Jewish people went through during World War II, you can make that argument. And you can certainly say that Hitler was against the Jews. Any historian would say that. So it's not really that far of a stretch to say that Hitler was the 7th. And that's not too hard to believe. Now, studies that I have done in the book that I've written, the Daniel prophecy, what I did was I looked for further evidence than just that interpretation. And the evidence I found was mathematical. Now the mathematics are very simple, but what I did was I took the amount of days that Hitler became in power to the time of his end of time when he was killed or committed suicide. Those are an exact amount of days, and the hint for that By the way, those numbers do come out exactly, which gives further strength to this idea that Van Kampen's original idea that Hitler was the seventh beast king, or the seventh empire with Nazi Germany. Now, you say, well, what other evidence might there be for that? And I have touched on this before, and it goes back to the primary prophetic chapter in Daniel chapter 9, and it is, if you look at the verses 24 to 27, which are the primary prophetic verses for chapter 9, what you find is at least a double timeline, because you have a time where Christ is cut off at 62 weeks, and you also have a time where Christ is cut off at 69 weeks. Verse 25 of chapter 9, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks. So that's 69. And that takes you to the time of the crucifixion, where he was cut off, or he was crucified. Then you have in verse 26, after 62 weeks, 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. Now, the King James, I like the King James interpretation where it says he was cut off, but not for himself. In other words, the translation of that is he was crucified, but not for himself. He died for us. He died to take our sins. He was cut off, but not for himself. So you have this time where within 2 verses, and we like to be exact, and it's just you're forced to come up with 2 timelines, one at the crucifixion at 62 weeks and one at the crucifixion of 69 weeks. Now they both work. Why do they work? Because in one timeline, the 69 weeks, we have that 1 week left. That's our future. And at 62 weeks, we've got more time to fill. Now, sorry, I pulled back off this, but the thing is, that time is filled. That time is filled. From the time that Christ was crucified to the time that the Jerusalem was destroyed and the sanctuary was torn down in 70 AD is given in that verse 26. After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince, this is the people of Rome, prince in King James lowercase, so he's not a holy prince, that shall come destroy the city and sanctuary, and thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Translation for that is, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the sanctuary, and there was a flood, and that was the Jewish diaspora. The remaining Jews at that time fled for their life, so they left the homeland. Most of them did. Now there was a handful. There was always a handful of Jews that stayed behind, but in the broad picture, they left, and that's where the with the flood description comes in. And it finishes that verse. It says, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. In other words, the Jews will continue to have conflict until the very end. Verse 27, and he shall confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week. That is all in the future, final 70th week of Daniel. So you see, Daniel describes prophetic time from, using the 62-week description in verse 26, he describes prophetic time from the crucifixion unto 70 AD. And that time is filled there. And I won't go through all the mathematical descriptions here, but they are in my book. And what shocks me, and I find astounding, is that it's really the message that I need to send, and that is that it's not hard to calculate the amount of days from the crucifixion date to destruction of Jerusalem. Time stops prophetically, and then it picks up with the time of Hitler, when he rose to power, and then to the time that he died. That time actually brings you up to 69 weeks minus 1 day, and that describes quite well what's going on here in chapter 9 of Daniel. It is a big topic. There's a lot of information in there to get to that point, but the point I'm trying to make here, and this is all history, this is the past, I'm not talking about the future. The point here is that there is prophetic time in the chapter, Daniel chapter 9, that is attributed to the reign and horrific deeds of the time of Hitler. When I was able to see this, and this didn't happen overnight, but I do think I was given holy direction in finding this. It shook me. I could feel it, because what this did was it continued, it gave meaning to the 62-week and the 69-week that Daniel talks about in chapter 9. Theologians have that's been a bugaboo the whole time. They've not been able to consolidate that. But using Van Kampen's idea that Hitler was the number 7, I went with that, and I used Isaac Newton's date of the crucifixion, which is in the year 34. And which, again, most theologians don't accept for various reasons, and that's a long topic itself. But using Isaac Newton's crucifixion date, and then just using a simple day counter online calendar, I was able to count days from that crucifixion date to destruction of Jerusalem, stop the time, and then pick up the time during the reign of Hitler, and it matches exactly. So understanding that gives meaning to this verses 17, 10, and 11 about this. In verse 10, the Hitler reference, we'll just call it the Hitler reference, and the other is not yet come. It was in the future of John. And when he comes, King James says cometh, and when he comes, he must continue for a short time. There can be no other evil entity in the history up to now that would even come close to the horrendous actions by Hitler toward the Jewish people. In fact, I'm so convinced of that correlation, I don't see how anyone can dispute it. And the question is, why would you dispute it if you knew what Hitler did? And there's no one else in line to fill that spot. So hopefully, I kind of rambled through here and missed a couple of words, but I'm doing this from memory, actually. So I've got my Bible in front of me, and I've got a brain that works at half speed, and hopefully I got my message across to you, what I was wanting to say. The details of what I've described is in my book. Now, you can say I'm trying to sell a book. That's fine. I don't sell that many books, so it's really not that big a deal to me. But what I'm trying to do is really get the message out. And I will probably come back and make some more videos describing these findings. But again, they're in the book that I wrote. And I spent, time doesn't always, the time, effort on some idea is not necessarily a proof that it's going to be right. I understand that. But yeah, I spent probably on and off, probably 15, 20 years, writing the book, doing the research, and rewriting the book as I narrowed down ideas that I had found. So I think, I look at the how this whole thing came about, of me finding this. When I say me, I was definitely given spiritual direction. And I just had a burning desire to know. So anyway, I hope this is helpful, and if you have any questions, put them down below, and I will answer them as best I can. And again, it's a big topic. It's a lot of new information that, to be honest with you, theologians don't review in deep depth. And so I just appreciate your time, and I would appreciate you looking more into it. And again, I'm happy to answer questions you might have on this. So thank you very much. You guys have a great day.